Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Power Attack. My name's Seth, and today we're going to be talking about Sekiro. I'm going to be giving a little bit of an unqualified opinion. So, Sekiro, or Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, or whatever you want to call it, is the newest FromSoft game. For people that don't know, FromSoft is pretty well known for Dark Souls and Bloodborne in particular. They're also well known for Armored Core. Generally, they're pretty well known for making hard games, and Sekiro is really not any different in that regard. It's very, very difficult. FromSoft has been making games for a long time now. They were founded in, 1986. They've been making games for over 30 years at this point. They are pretty well known for their really obscure world building, and of course they're probably most well known for Hidetaka Miyazaki, who is the director of Dark Souls. Well, all but 2, which we don't talk about. The game is published by Activision, who is probably most well known for Call of Duty, but they've been publishing games for a really long time. They've actually also been around since the early 80s. Most notably, they published Singularity. They worked on Crash Bandicoot, at least as of 2008. They're known for the Tenchu series. They did Wolfenstein from 2003 to 2009. And like I said, they're really very well known for Call of Duty in particular. They're also well known for some very questionable business practices, including but not limited to some monetization policies and some player-related monetization methods that involved essentially showcasing loot box drops that other people got to players in one of the more recent Call of Duties. I think this was them. To try and get people to buy loot boxes. I believe Activision's also the company that was trying to patent a matchmaking system that would matchmake people that didn't buy product with people that did, to make them jealous or feel like they needed to buy guns in games to perform better. They're generally just not particularly well known for being super consumer friendly, but they do have a pedigree of publishing behind them. They're pretty highly regarded in their publishing list, and they, as long as their hands aren't directly involved in the development process, generally make pretty good games. I mean, really, their developed games are pretty good too. It's just they're known for some questionable behavior. So that's some basic background on these guys, but what about the game, right? Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. It's interesting. It's very difficult. It's obviously a third-person action-adventure game, very much in the Souls series kind of genre, albeit much faster. I'd liken it more, I think, to Bloodborne. And that's not a bad thing, but it is going to turn a lot of people off. It's definitely significantly harder than anything that I think we've seen FromSoft make before. Maybe with the exception of Dark Souls 2, but we'll talk about why I think that's a little different in a bit. It lacks a lot of the Souls series kind of staples, which general RPG staples, I guess, is more accurate. There's no character creation. You're stuck with how Wolf, or Sekiro, he is referred to by both names. You're stuck to how Wolf looks here. You can't really customize him at all. You can customize a little bit in terms of what his arm looks like, but it's not really out of look. It's out of necessity of performance, because his arm behaves differently depending on what situation you need. Sometimes you need the axe to break some shields. Sometimes you need the shuriken to quick tap enemies that have low health or knock guys out of the air, which we'll see me quick tapping enemies with it probably a fair bit later in the video. So you have some very, very limited technical appearance customization in the form of that, but you're not really ever going to be thinking of it in that regard. You're mostly going to be considering it from the perspective of in the moment assessing it. The leveling system has also been, I don't want to say neutered because that implies that there's not as much depth, but there's kind of not as much depth in some regards. The leveling system has been, as best I can tell, now 7 or 8 hours into the game. I restarted for this video to get some early game footage. But 7 or 8 hours into the game, I think I've mostly unlocked the leveling system in its entirety, in terms of like what types of leveling I'll see now. There's a skill tree, multiple skill trees. Some of them unlock latent passive abilities, some of them unlock active attacks and behaviors like being able to slide. There's also upgrading to the arm. It's got its own skill tree, which will affect certain abilities. I have 4 arms where I am in the main game, and each of them seem to have some abilities that can be unlocked respectively. The skill trees are obviously a little less nuanced. They're a little more straightforward. You're not going to see people having to like deeply calculate their level path like they did in Dark Souls and Bloodborne, where you saw people calculating every single level for 120 levels because every single point affected like 5 or 6 different stats. And that's probably good because the combat is so much more nuanced that I think that people are going to want to focus more on their individual playstyle and less on their individual stat spread. The game really, I don't think, would benefit from dex and strength and faith and int and all those traditional Dark Souls staples, or even the Bloodborne ones of having just martials and like arcana and stuff like that. But I do think there's risk that this system could stagnate. Partially as a result of the death system, there's definitely a risk of stagnation as a result of players just not strictly necessarily being skilled enough to get through certain parts of the game. There's risk as a result of maybe you stop getting new arms. I'm not sure when you get all the arms. I've got 4 right now, but I'm also, as far as I can tell, quite early in the game. And it seems like maybe I'll get more, but it's hard to say for sure. The game is set in something very tentatively resembling... They say that it's set in the Sengoku period, in 16th century Japan, but it's clearly not meant to be like real world Japan, and there's a number of reasons for that. Most people that have any knowledge of the background of this game will find that that's pretty much a given, because you're talking about a game where your character can come back from the dead, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But there's also things like ogres and giant snakes and all kinds of other weird, definitely not natural shit happening. Like, there's a mini-boss that I've encountered that I haven't yet beat, who's called the Headless. I'll let you guess what the defining feature of that mini-boss is. If you guess that he's missing his left arm, you're wrong. That'd be me. Sekiro/Wolf. Haha. There's also no online component, which as far as I can tell is a first in this kind of Soulsborne-esque series. It's hard to say Sekiro explicitly fits into the Soulsborne franchise, because it's really not a Soulsborne game, but it definitely gives similar energy, particularly because it's such a difficult game. I think a lot of people are going to make that comparison. But there's no online component, which is counter to all the other games. There's no... The storytelling and world building are polar opposite to Dark Souls. You're told many things in the game. You get a little blurb at the beginning of the game that's talking about the setting. instead of just kind of trying to figure stuff out. There's definitely still an emphasis on reading item descriptions and things like that, so if you're a Dark Souls fan, I think this is still a good game for the lore nerds out there. But you're not going to be able to like run through and pick up your friend and help them through the game. You're not going to be able to invade other players. That stuff just doesn't exist here, which is kind of strange. It's a little bit weird feeling. I don't think it's a bad thing necessarily. I think it's probably a pretty good thing, but it is definitely weird. I think probably that's a good thing. I can't imagine trying to deal with invaders in this game. It would be such a hectic situation. And a lot of fights kind of devolve into deflect battles anyway, where you're just kind of waiting on the enemy to attack, and I don't think that would necessarily facilitate good online play. Maybe I'm wrong. It's hard to say. I think it being online, lacking an online component, is probably good for the AI design too, because it means that the AI for bosses isn't trying to figure out what the fuck to do when there's like 3 dudes in the room and it is trying to hit all 3 at once with its big wide sweeping attack. Instead, it can just focus on you and behave the way that it's supposed to. I can think of one fight in particular in Dark Souls 3, the fight with Dark Eater Midir, where if you had summoned an ally, it would often have attacks that were meant to be dodgeable if you ran the correct directions, but because it would try to hit both of you, it would oftentimes be completely undodgeable because it would change the angle of the attack. So, probably they learned a lesson from Dark Souls 3 there, and probably that has something to do with their decision not to include any multiplayer component, and probably that's a good thing. It's hard to say for sure. I guess that's a good point to get into the combat. The combat is interesting. Health bars aren't really health bars. They're kind of lies. Health bars are actually a lot more like... They're like regen bars, I guess is the way that you could describe it. Because enemies have stamina or posture or stance or whatever you'd like to call it. I think the game calls it posture. I may call it stance periodically through this video. And the focus on combat is that you really generally don't want to be focusing on chip damaging at their health. You want to be breaking their posture. You want them to take a swing at you. You want to deflect that swing. They'll fill a meter that will slowly dissipate. And if they keep hitting you and you keep deflecting, that meter will fill up over time. And then once it fills up, you will break their posture and you'll be able to attack them for a full health bar. Depleting enemy HP can be used to kill enemies, but mostly what it's used for is that when an enemy's HP is low, their posture meter dissipates at a slower rate, so you have more time to build that posture meter before it goes away. And that's the same for you. So healing and being at mid to full health is a lot more important than it was in something like Dark Souls or Bloodborne, where your stamina was totally separate from your health. There's no stamina meter in Sekiro, so you're kind of more focused on this posture meter and your health as a result of that. Once the enemy's stance is broken, you can remove the full health bar. You get a couple iframes where you're in the middle of an attack on them and nothing else can hit you, and you'll knock enemies back a little bit, and it gives you a chance to like get away if you've managed to break someone, because fighting multiple enemies at once is incredibly difficult in this game. They don't wait for you, they don't come at you one at a time, they're attacking you all at once, and they each have their own posture meter, and you're doing so little damage until you break their posture that you're having to fight them for minutes on end at a time. Some enemies, like mini-bosses and bosses, also have multiple health bars, and that plays into the stealth mechanic a lot more. Mini-bosses in particular often have some backup dancers with them, some goons that like to sit around and give you a hard time and exist to make the mini-boss harder than he is. And so frequently what you'll have to do is you'll have to stealth around and kill some of the goons without alerting everyone, or you may alert a couple people and then kill a couple and then run away and break aggro, and those goons won't respawn unless you rest, of course. However, if you stealth, you can also just instantly, if you have a stealth kill on someone where you've gotten up behind them where they haven't even noticed that you're there, or you jump on them from above and they don't know you're there, you instantly have broken their posture functionally, and you get a free health bar off them. That includes mini-bosses and bosses. So, if you can sneak up and kill everyone and then sneak up to the mini-boss, you can take a full health meter away. They oftentimes have 2. I suspect that number will increase as the game progresses. However, if you do that, they're obviously going to aggro on you, and you can no longer break aggro from them. You can break aggro and run away, but if you do, they get that first health bar back. So you can't cheese stealth kill most mini-bosses. Other than mini-bosses having some backup dancers around them, and bosses generally being just a little bit harder, there's not a significant difference between the two. A mini-boss in something like Dark Souls 3, or sometimes Bloodborne or something like that, was often a little bit difficult, but it was more difficult than the average enemy, but not as difficult as a boss by any stretch. Many of the mini-bosses are quite difficult. I'm not sure if I got any footage of me fighting Enshin, but if I did, I'll put it here, if I remember to. Otherwise, there's footage of me fighting a mini-boss in the first segment, I believe. And they can be challenging. When you fight them the first time, they're very difficult. After you've fought them before, like I did here, they get a lot easier. Because, as I said, I reset the game for this footage, and it was a lot easier generally to get through the zone. I got through a zone that probably took me 5 hours the first day in less than an hour today. I guess that's probably a good point to get to. The fact that the reason that combat is so much more difficult is you have to counter. You cannot dodge. You have a jump and you have a step dodge, and they both can be used to duck out of some attacks, but you get way fewer iframes than you used to. You may not get any iframes. I'm not sure. It's hard to tell on the step dodge, and obviously you get none on the jump. And as such, your block button is your only safe way to avoid most damage. There's one exception to that, and we'll talk about that in a moment. When you block, if you tap the block or press it at just the right time, I guess more accurately, you deflect instead, which does significant posture damage to the enemy. When you block or deflect, you also take some posture damage. So you're having a battle where you're measuring out your own posture damage versus the enemies. And that's very interesting. It's very, very difficult. Usually it's best not to fight everything, and oftentimes it's best to stealth your way through and kill a couple enemies, whatever's in your way. Sometimes it's best just not to fight. Especially because some enemies can't I suppose some attacks can't be countered more accurately. There are a type of attack called Perilous Attacks, which cannot be deflected. The only way to get around them are by jumping over them in the case that it's a low sweeping attack, step dodging them in some cases where I can think of one in particular when I show you the Lady Butterfly fight later on. There's an attack where she uses an overhead slam, and step dodging out of that is the best way. And thrusting attacks, so stabbing with a spear, there's a way to counter that with an early ability that you can unlock from the skill tree, but you can't otherwise get around it. The only way to get around it otherwise, I think, is to just run away. Or die, I suppose, which is something to get into. You can revive in this game. You have 2 revive options. The first is replenished on rest. The second occasionally happens when you killed enough enemies. Getting killed allows you to revive, but sets the second revive on a cooldown. The way to remove that cooldown is by finishing a full health bar of a boss or mini-boss. I think mini-bosses count. Or killing enough enemies, or I think if you wait long enough, that cooldown will be removed as well. Dying without revive causes you to lose Sen, which is the currency, and some experience, though experience is quite easy to get. This kind of really means that you're going to want to spend very frequently. You don't really want to sit on money and experience, which is similar to Dark Souls in that regard, where experience and money were the same thing. You didn't ever want to sit on too much, because if you did, you were risking losing it every time you died. That was a risk. There is an exception. There's a lot of this but exception in the game. There's a lot of you need to deflect everything except the thing that you can't deflect. You need to spend all your money because you risk losing, or in this case, except when you don't. There's a % chance for something called unseen aid. It's a percentage chance that occurs when you die. It rolls a dice, and if you roll within the margin, it says, oh hey, you don't lose any money or experience. You get basically a free reset back to the Buddha statue, which is the bonfire in this game. And that's kind of neat. I wish that there was a way to more measurably rely on it. That % chance also goes down if you die too much, because if you die too much, you eventually get something called Dragon Rot, which affects NPCs. The effects of this are kind of unclear to me right now. They've implied that NPCs may die as a result of this, and could cause quest lines to go dormant. And again, the more NPCs that you have that have Dragon Rot, the less % chance you have for unseen aid. The lowest I've seen it get so far is 13%, but I know for a fact that I think the baseline is 30%. I know for a fact I think. Haha. Dragon Rot can be removed from every NPC using a finite resource called Dragon Blood Droplets. They can be bought from NPCs, certain NPCs for quite cheap. It's, I think, 180 cents. They're pretty easy to acquire, but you only have a limited number of them, so you have to be very careful about your use of them. And I assume you only want to use them either when an NPC is like on the brink of death, or is necessary for quests. I'm just going to kind of mention a couple very general statements at this point. The movement feels pretty good. It's fast, it's fluid. It feels more fluid than Bloodborne ever did, which is saying quite a bit, because Bloodborne's big selling point for a lot of people was that the movement was so unique. The grappling hook tied into your prosthetic arm gives you a lot of exploration options, as well as the fact that there's wall climbing and ledge grabbing and many other ways to traverse a zone. It means that zones are often kind of long corridors in a way that people often criticize Dark Souls 2 for, but they feel more explorative by nature than Dark Souls 2 ever did, where, yes, I always have to go north right now to get to the next zone, but there are probably a dozen different ways that I can go north, in different paths I can take, different ways to get north. Whereas Dark Souls 2 was very much, you have to go north, and there are 2 paths, and you can pick which one you want, but there's only 2. I think this is a good time to talk about why I think the combat is less bullshit feeling than Dark Souls 2, despite the fact that you run into frequent situations where you're dealing with gang squads of enemies, and generally why I think people are going to be more okay with the lack of iframes and things like that in Sekiro than in Dark Souls 2. Dark Souls 2 had a lot of problems tied to the iframe issue, where there was a stat that affected your amount of iframes, or I realize I haven't said this, invincibility frames on dodges. And so raising a stat gave you more invincibility frames. And that, I don't think, meshed very well with people, as well as the fact that the controls were generally unresponsive feeling, they were clunky, there was delay. I think Sekiro doesn't suffer from that in the same regard, because A, there's no way to increase those iframes as best I can tell so far. So you're stuck with it. So your main primary source of dodging is different. You're deflecting more than dodging. And I think that that's a big difference to start with. Secondarily, I think, and this is just my opinion, I'm not positive, I think that Sekiro is more fluid feeling generally. It feels responsive. There have been times where I've felt like it's sometimes feeling unresponsive, but generally it feels pretty good. It also looks a lot better than it ever has, and Dark Souls 2 is kind of muddy and ugly. It sounds a lot better than it ever has. The Japanese voice acting is fantastic. The translations seem really good. The animations look good. You don't have to rest at bonfires anymore. You can sit at a Buddha statue or bonfire equivalent and upgrade and use your experience without resting and respawning enemies, which I think is a huge boon. With that said, there's some downsides. The game's harder than it's ever been. For some people that's not a downside, but sometimes it does feel unfair. Sometimes it does feel like it was made hard just to be difficult, and that's not, I think, necessarily what everyone wants. Soulsborne players also kind of feel like they may be at a disadvantage, because the muscle memory for a lot of players is to dodge rather than deflect, because not every attack could be deflected in Dark Souls. Whereas the vast majority can here. I think that's going to make a difference. As well as, and I already mentioned this, there's some risk of stagnation of gameplay in the form of upgrades and arms becoming less frequent over time. The fact that there's no equipment or character customization or anything like that may affect things negatively down the line. I guess, really, I think this game is probably better. I feel like it's probably better than Dark Souls, but it definitely has a lot to get used to. It's very difficult, and it's very different. It might be hard to directly compare this to Soulsborne games. The closest you could compare it to is Bloodborne, and there's clear influence there. The best I could say is check it out. I think this game's worth it. It's $60. I think it's more worth it than a lot of other $60 titles out there. Alright, I guess that's it.